Welcome to the London Commercial Offices podcast with me, your host, Steve Berridge, Managing Director at Fidgens Cost Management. This is a podcast where we share the stories, career paths, lessons and insights from some of the industry's most influential people. Anything contained within our podcast should not be considered professional advice, and if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe or follow buttons to ensure you don't miss any of the amazing guests we've got coming up. It also really helps us grow the show. Thanks. I'm joined today by Simon Cooke, founder of APAM, a specialist real estate asset manager. APAM is part of the Catella AB network, which has over $14 billion of assets under management. Today we'll take a deep dive on Simon's fascinating career, as well as other interests, including Antarctica and the 2041 school charity. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Simon to the show.
Thank you very much.
We're actually in a podcast studio today, rather than online, which is a first for me. So we'll see how we get on. Who knows, if it works, perhaps we'll do all of our podcasts from here moving forwards. Simon, as you know from our previous episodes, we like to start right back at the beginning from a very young Simon, so our audience can get kind of a flavour of where you came from, how you grew up, and the factors that might influence some of the decisions that you made along your kind of journey. So, if I can start, what were you like as a child?
Oh gosh, Stephen, that's an interesting starting point. First of all, it's a very long time ago. I would like to say I was a happy child. I was a very lucky child. I was born into a lovely family. But I did suffer, as a lot of people of my generation did, being sent away to boarding school at a very early age. So I would say that I had separation anxiety from the age of 7.5 or so, being thrown into an all-male boys' environment. But that made me a bit more resilient, perhaps, a little bit more hearty, as they would say, and certainly I threw myself deeply into sport. So I certainly wasn't academic. I failed my 11 plus. And was
did I should say. I think I got in on appeal from memory.
I had to retake, and so I stayed down another year, and therefore I was quite old for my year group. By the time I left school at 19 years old. Having actually become a little bit more academic over the years. But yeah, my love was sport, outdoor activity, adventure.
So you were boarding, as in boarding school, so you were sent away for large periods of time?
It was, in those days, there wasn't much exeat weekends or weekly boarding systems. It was, you're away. My father was in the Army, British Army, based in Germany, so I very much relied upon my grandparents based in Yorkshire to be my sort of domestic help, and went back there for holidays and half terms if they existed. I can't even remember if we did have half terms during the middle of the school term.
And how long were you at that boarding school? Was that right up until university?
So 7.5 through to 19 years old. It was a school called Stonyhurst, Catholic, as I said, all-male school in Lancashire.
Up to 19 and an all-male environment.
Tough environment, and definitely, as I said, made you a little bit more resilient and independent.
So you mentioned sport, so I'm going to guess rugby.
Played a lot of rugby, that was my love, but you would throw yourself into anything because it was outdoors, it was fun, it wasn't sitting in a classroom. And I think probably I was lucky. I was very athletic, and I wanted to get stuck in. And I think also, just going back to that anxiety, that separation anxiety, I think playing sport and playing well, scoring the hat trick or kicking the goal or bowling the player out, gave you a sense of being wanted, loved or cared for, I think, and that was a desperate component of that early era where people who were not based in their families were lacking in that appreciation as such.
It's funny because looking from the outside, and I didn't go to public school, but you might think, God, privileged, fantastic, excellent, great opportunity. People don't think about that other side.
I think it's interesting. I think it only comes back much later in life. You know, when you have your own children, you realise that sending them away to school is an option. Do they really want to go? Did you feel that you didn't have the same relationship that you would want with your children, that you didn't have that relationship with your parents? And I think definitely now, looking back on it, it was something that has stayed in my system for a very long time, as a lot of others. And I think there's a lot of our generation now looking back at not trauma, but certainly having to adapt to a non-family environment at a very early age.
So academically wise then, obviously you said you love sport, but were you a clever kid at school?
No, as I said, I failed my 11 plus. Certainly wasn't keen on.
And was that all subjects? Or
Yeah, no, pretty much. I have to say I was a very poor academic. Looking at some of the letters I wrote home at the age of 8 or 9, they weren't particularly literate. Yeah, I was actually interesting because I grew up in Germany and went to a nursery school in Germany. I was more fluent in German than I was in English, and so I was probably behind the curve in relation to being able to write in English. Of course, they wouldn't allow me to learn German at the school. I was taught French, which was very confusing. So, yeah, it was a difficult period, actually, because there was lots of concern as to whether I would actually be good enough to go on and qualify for the higher schools within a competitive environment. But then that's where the sport came in. Of course, if I was captain of rugby or captain of cricket, that was always going to help.
You had a ticket of some
Exactly.
description. At that same school up until 18, 19?
Yeah, because in those days you did the Oxbridge exams post your A-level results. So you did an extra term. So you came back, you did your A-levels in the summer. I did those in the summer of 78.
And what were they, just out of interest?
I did geography, history and English.
And did well in them?
I did okay. I I think I surprised a few people. I got an A and 2 Bs, which was above what my expectations were at the time. But I remember very clearly saying that I wanted to go to Cambridge and go back to school for an extra term to take the Oxbridge exams, and the headmaster writing a very clear letter to my parents saying this would be a waste of money, and Simon didn't stand a chance. Now, of course, in those days, the academics were part of the acceptance challenge at Cambridge, but luckily other factors came into hand as well. So by then I was actually a relatively competent rugby player, and that certainly helped to get me into the Cambridge side.
What was the driving force behind you wanting to go to Cambridge as opposed to any other?
I'll be honest. It was about the rugby. It was a way of playing, in effect, top class Premiership rugby within an academic setup, all looked after, beautiful pitches, excellent competition and players, and a first class fixture list. So it was a stepping stone to becoming in effect, semi-professional rugby player in those days.
So then moving into, you did the exams, you presumably interviewed.
Yep.
And whether or not because of rugby or not remains to be seen, but got accepted into Cambridge.
I got accepted into Magdalen College, Cambridge. Had a lovely interview with the master, who the great late Tom Howarth, who his first statement as I walked in the room was, "Oh, you're a big lad for a centre." So I knew I was at least on a good starting point with him. I started on a course called Archaeology and Anthropology. Certainly a course that they couldn't test me on in terms of a pre-interview, because I knew very little about archaeology and anthropology, and they knew that. And then we switched to the land economy course, which was a 2-year part 2, which in effect qualified you as long as you got through those exams and did 2 years of professional training at a surveying firm as an RICS qualified surveyor.
So was that a sort of a straight degree at Cambridge, or was there a sandwich year kind of in the middle where you were out in the industry?
No, it was a straight 2-year part 2,
straight
so 1 year
2 year
archaeology
playing
and
rugby with a little bit of study.
Well, it was 3 years because of the archaeology and anthropology, and then 2 years of focusing on the exams to try and get through those. And must admit, a lot of the sporting guys did have a lot of help in those days, a little bit of guidance as to where they should focus their attentions in order to actually pass through the exam process.
A successful time at uni?
Loved it.
And in terms of qualifying, in terms of your degree, what did you walk away with?
I got a 2-1, respectable level. And actually in those days applied to 2 or 3 organisations in London, and was lucky enough to be offered to start as a graduate at both Richard Ellis in those days, the original CBRE, and Savills, both of whom were excellent organisations. And I was persuaded to go to Richard Ellis by a lovely fellow, the late great Andrew Oakes, who was running a very successful sales team at Richard Ellis at the time, and was a Cambridge man and a sportsman in his own right, and very much found there was a lot of empathy with him. Even though he wasn't my first boss, it was very much him encouraging me to come to Richard Ellis that made me make that decision.
So there was a rugby element to Cambridge. There was also a rugby element to your first proper job.
Completely.
Sensing a pattern.
Well, there's a bit of that, and in that, again, it was an amateur sport in those days. No one was earning any money out of playing rugby, but you needed to have an employee who was going to accommodate your needs for training. There was a prestige in the industry. Obviously, the surveyors had their own team as well, and there was the seven-a-side competitions, the company seven-a-side competitions that still exist today. Were highly competitive, and people wanted to have successful teams in those competitions. So, to some degree, pre the technical aspects of real estate, knowing people, being able to phone people up at different firms, being known was a very important component of the job. When you were asked to find valuation evidence from a surveyor in the north of England who may or may not have done a good rent review on an office building or a shop, the only way to get that information was to ring them up. And of course, if it was someone you'd played rugby against the week before, that was a much easier conversation than just cold calling.
Talk me through your first day at Richard Ellis, because I think we've spoken previously, and I was quite surprised by how your first day went. But so you're a graduate from Cambridge, day one in Richard Ellis. You walk into your office.
Well, it's an interesting start, because actually I was playing for London Irish at the time. London Irish had played against Northern on the Saturday in Newcastle, so I'm a long way from London. And that evening I was persuaded to stay overnight and play in the Northern seven-a-sides for a guest team, as a guest player for a team on the Sunday. And then I arrived back at the London Irish ground, which was in Sunbury in those days, at probably about 1 o'clock in the morning, with a decision to either drive into town for my first day at work or to drive back to my parents, and they lived out in Hampshire, and then try and get a very early train back into town, leaving the car there. And I took the decision to drive into town, so I drove into Bruton Street, found Bruton Lane, around the back of the Richard Ellis office in those days, which was at 6 to 10 Bruton Street, parked the car, got into a sleeping bag and got myself a few hours kip. And of course woke up very early, feeling a bit musty, and knocked on the door, and luckily the overnight security guard let me in and pointed me towards the showers and the gents' changing rooms. And as a result, I was actually the first person in the office sitting at a desk, hoping it was the desk that I was going to be starting at, guessing it was a desk I was going to be starting at. One of the partners came in and asked me who I was, what I was doing there. I explained, and he said to me, "Well, Simon, do you have a driving licence?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Great." And he threw his car keys at me and said, "There is an Aston Martin parked on Bruton Lane. Would you mind driving it around Berkeley Square, around the back of Berkeley Square House, and parking it in car park number 33. So I pretty much knew from a very early stage where my position was in the company.
But that position didn't stay that position for very long.
You were certainly, the lowest of the low whilst you were training as a surveyor, and you did what you were you were told to do, and you did it well. You worked as hard as you possibly could, but you were very much collecting information, making, finalising reports, reading. I remember reading leases on microfiche, which were translucent cards with the light shining underneath them, projecting them, the words of those leases onto the walls, and thinking this is a really tough place to start. But it taught you a lot. You listened a lot to your seniors. And luckily by the time I'd qualified, I was moving on, working with extremely competent and capable people, got dragged through into the investment department, working with a legendary guy called Stephen Hubbard, and we managed to do some really interesting business in the West End of London, some large-scale development, some large deals, and that sort of put my name a bit more higher up the list for being noticed. And I became a salaried partner at Richard Ellis before I was 28 years old. So it seemed like a rapid rise, but we were dealing with large buildings. I wasn't being paid large amounts of money, and it was a very successful period for real estate. The mid to late 80s was a boom market in town. So I was very lucky to be part of that and have Stephen as my boss.
I mean, I know it was a long time ago, but if you could sort of cast your mind back, so you're 28, doing very well for yourself, obviously earned a partner at Richards Ellis. Did you imagine, a long-term future there?
Yeah, completely. At that point, I am fully committed. I love the people, love the job. I'm enjoying my sport still. And I remember walking around Berkeley Square in the mid to late 80s thinking, how lucky am I? This is the perfect world. It wasn't until the end of 1989 that the writing was on the wall for the markets. And it was one of my first real internal conversations I had to have with myself, because I had probably £200-300 million worth of assets to sell, and I couldn't get a phone call returned. As I said, everything was dealt with by phone in those days, and I was ringing agents and they were just simply not even coming back to me because nobody had a buyer. And I had to sit down with Stephen Hubbard and explain to him that I thought 1990 was going to be a very tough year for fees, and that the targets that I'd been set were simply unachievable. And there was a slight, there was a denial in relation to how severe the situation was. And I went home at Christmas, talked to my family, particularly my parents, and I said, I'm going to have to make a decision. I don't think this is the future, because I don't really want to be in an environment that lurches from feast to famine. And I probably reached the end of the line in just my broker approach. And given that, I was looking then, where do I go? I could only ever go to probably another competitor, which I didn't want to do. The funds certainly weren't employing anybody. And luckily, I got a phone call again from a contact, a chap called Richard Cundall, who had sold his property company at the peak of the market in September 1989. And he'd been asked by Morgan Grenfell, the merchant bank, in their asset management division to set up a new property business. And through pure luck, he called me and said, would I be interested in being his junior in that very small team in that startup business. And I joined them in March 1990.
So a big, I'm going to say, risk on your part, jumping from a partner of a very well-respected London agency to a junior at a startup, essentially, albeit part of a...
Well, worse than that. Richard was a man of quite strong words, and he told me the day I arrived, he said, sit in the back of the car, say nothing, listen to everything, you know nothing. And we did about 60 or 70,000 miles in the back of that 190E Mercedes as we drove around the country, and I had to almost retrain my mindset. One, because I was a London specialist and had brokered larger London transactions, typically with international clients. And now I was really looking at the more broader real estate market from an investment perspective, with discretionary capital that had been raised through the Morgan Grenfell funds, the new funds, but with an opportunity to really change the nature of my career, and learning again from really capable and competent people who I greatly respected.
And what was the vision for that new startup fund?
Well, it was
buy, add value, retain?
Yeah, it was designed to be a series of funds. Actually, they were the first ever offshore, so Jersey property unit trusts, but they were also sector specific. So they were office, industrial and retail funds. And the investors were either giving us their money as an allocation to real estate or choosing to rebalance their existing exposures to retail, office or industrial by using our sector funds in order to do that. But of course, they didn't have any assets in them, and we were lucky we were buying those assets at a time when the market was back on its heels. So we had a great opportunity to deliver some impressive performance numbers.
So where are we in terms of timings?
This is 1990 through to about 93 or 4, when Richard felt that he'd done his bit. He'd set the funds up. He'd got them running. They were going very, very well. He and a chap called John Partridge, who later went on to be the top man at Cordia Savills, and also prior to that, Henderson, before it was Nuveen. And they, for whatever reasons, decided 93, 94 that they were done and they were ready to move on. Richard went off to run his own little portfolio based in Ludlow. And John, as I said, had already moved on to work with Andrew Baum at Real Estate Strategy and was forming a more strategic approach to selling research into the real estate industry. And it sort of left me sort of holding the baby, really, and perhaps at risk that they would bring someone in more capable to run them, but they gave me the chance, and so I took them over in about 94.
What sort of assets under management, team size was that?
By now, we're probably about 300 or 400 million of assets under management, and we only had about 2 or 3 people in the team. Obviously, a massive support network because of Morgan Grenfell, compliance officers and HR people and administrative support, accounting support. But in terms of real estate focused people, only 2 or 3. And my job was to grow it and to build the team. And we did that, and we built it up to about £1 billion of assets under management by the end of the decade. We also launched some really interesting funds known as venture funds, or in today's terminology, they would be regarded as the very first opportunistic funds. So again, investors could choose their risk profile alongside their sector profile in relation to whether they wanted to go into higher risk, leveraged trading and development type funds, or indeed collect income and be in a more risk-averse exposure to property by going into the standard retail, office and industrial funds.
A quick 15-second pause in today's content to tell you about the amazing work we do at Fidgins. We're a small but powerful team of cost consultants based on Oxford Street and focused on the London commercial sector. We help project managers and end users successfully deliver a vision for their projects. For our smaller schemes, 10,000 square foot and upwards, we offer a neat one-stop solution covering PM, CM and EA roles, which is particularly well suited for fast-paced, budget-constrained projects. We also work with a range of brilliant project managers on larger office fit-outs where we solely provide cost management services. These currently include 2 exciting large occupier schemes, both with build costs in excess of 20 million. Whether you're an end user, an asset manager or a project manager, our only rule is that you're nice to work with, because life's too short to not enjoy your day job. So if you want to find out how we do things differently, send me a message on LinkedIn and we can have a chat. Now, back to the show. So you're now leading another team. Things are going incredibly well. And there's a reason I want to pick up on this point. So similar to your days at Richard Ellis, you kind of thought, this is it. I've made it. I know where I'm going. I know what my future is. So you had a future that's changed. You now have another future planned in your mind. Talk to me about the years leading up to you leaving Morgan Grenfell, and sort of, we don't need to go into too much detail on the incidents, but
it was a 2 or 3 phase program, really. First of all, I loved the place, loved the job, loved the funds, loved the team. The team was really good. A lot of the people who were in that team have become incredibly successful in their own rights now elsewhere. And we had a real work hard, play hard attitude in the days when that was allowed as such. It was all going really, really well. Morgan Grenfell itself was revered as one of the most successful equity fund management houses in the UK as well. It was growing rapidly and was winning lots of business, particularly from local authority pension schemes. And yeah, you're right. I couldn't have been in a more successful and interesting environment and enjoying it. However, those of you who've got long memories will remember that there was an event, and it was basically pre the Bearings event, where a chap called Peter Young was in effect falsely accounting for his equity funds, European equity funds, by buying unquoted, having the unquoted companies revalued at massive premiums, and then claiming large performance in relation to the performance of his overall European equity funds. And that all came to unravel in about 96, 97. The senior leadership lost their jobs. I was left really very much in an environment where it was get on with it on your own whilst we rebuild the rest of the business. And at that point, Deutsche Bank, who already owned the business, decided to step in a bit more, usurp more control. We're looking to globalize the Deutsche Bank presence. And in 97, they bought Bankers Trust. And in 1998, they bought Reef in America. From an 18-month period, rather than reporting into my local UK trusted leadership team, I was now on airplanes flying to New York and Chicago, explaining why I had, bought 300,000 square foot, 300,000 pound buildings in places like Lincoln. So, to some degree, there was a culture shock. There was a lack of understanding of how local our business was and how important that was to its local investors, whilst the larger strategy was globalization. And it became a battle, to be honest with you. By 1999, the changes were being made. We were still growing the business, but not at the rate that Deutsche Bank and the American businesses wanted. Was also, unfortunately, my wife at this point was suffering from cancer and sadly passed away in 2001. And so there was a real human reflection moment. 2 young kids at home, and there was a real need for me to reset. Neocortex, or the thinking part of your brain, the logical part of your brain, was saying, do not give up your job. This is madness. This is a great job. You're very privileged and lucky to be where you are. Stop complaining about having to jump on airplanes, etc., etc. The limbic part of the brain, the empathetic part of the brain, was crying for me to
be home.
To be home, rebase, and think about something different than making money. So by in 2001, I had put a proposal to Deutsche Bank to, in effect, partially MBO the business and bring it into a more localized environment, leaving them with a decent shareholding in the business. That was firmly rejected, and I resigned from the business in 2003.
So that's 2 steadfast careers that you'd mapped out, and at each point in time thought that you were set, thought you knew where you were going.
Well,
but
9 years at Richard Ellis and 14 years at Morgan Grenfell. So those days you did pretty much stick to your job as well. There was less opportunity, there was less volatility. You kept your nose down and worked hard and hopefully progressed. And I was a very, 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 all the way through, very happy with what I was doing and how I was being rewarded. But it's a stark lesson that fundamentally you've got to trust your own instinct at times when you know that the cultures of the business are changing and they're not suited to what you envisaged.
Absolutely. So you left Deutsche Bank.
Yep.
To join nowhere.
No, I needed to go home. I needed to put a cold towel around my head. I needed to rethink. But here comes the serendipity. So I mentioned a lovely chap called Andrew Oakes persuaded me to join Richard Ellis in 1982. And Andrew Oakes popped up again through a phone call from him and my old landlaw tutor from Cambridge, and said to me, we hear you're sitting at home twiddling your thumbs, not sure what to do next. Why don't you come and have lunch with us in Milton Keynes?
And where did that come from? How did they find out?
They'd read an article in the FT saying that I'd resigned, or the Times or somewhere.
LinkedIn and Facebook,
much before that, or through the network of people saying, oh, by the way, Simon's now at home and he's looking after his kids. Anyway, they rang and said, come and have lunch. We had a couple of glasses of wine. We talked about what they were up to. They were working with a syndicated business in Milton Keynes, and they needed somebody to drive some of the property aspects of that. So rather than take a job, I said, that's fine. I'll become a property advisor to that business. I'll inject some money into it. So I invested in the shares in the company. Their role was to collate the capital. My role was to find interesting property transactions. So it was fun because it was back to basics again. It was finding the opportunity. It was very entrepreneurial. It was small scale. It was backing your own knowledge and instinct in relation to buying well, adding value at the asset level, and then selling it on. We formed a business called Cooke and Powell. I met at that within this organisation a young man called William Powell at the time, and he became my business partner for 20 plus years post that serendipity lunch. And we built a lovely little business. We probably bought about £150 million worth of real estate in between 2003 and 2006. We had to not only secure the transactions, we had to raise the money, we had to persuade the investors to invest, we had to put money in ourselves, we had to raise debt, and we had to do all the due diligence as well on the acquisition. So there was a lot of running around, a lot of juggling, and I had to buy a lot of favours from the market in terms of be patient. We say we're going to buy this, but it's going to take a little bit longer because,
So you were finding a deal, doing the deal, but not necessarily having the capital to back it up. Then
at the time of agreeing to do the transaction, having no capital, and then having to run around and backfill the equity and the debt and do all the legals and the due diligence and make sure. So this was not a fund model. This was a transaction by transaction basis. Cooke and Powell was the advisor to the syndicates and an investor in them. and it was great. It was hard work, of course, but there was very little competition in the market. But by the middle of 2006, every time we said to an agent, by the way, we're going to do this, we'll pay you £10 million, and they were saying, how long is it going to take for you to transact? I would say, well, probably somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the debt and depending on...
Which doesn't sound unreasonable.
Which doesn't, in those days, was also not unreasonable. And they were all, bless them, laughing at me, saying that there was an Irishman or another buyer who had a bag of cash in a briefcase, which he'd borrowed from Anglo-Irish or Bank of Ireland or the banks of the day, and they were exchanging in 5 days. So I went back to the syndicate business and said, look, I think the model's broken. I don't think we can perform and buy any more. I think given the environment and given how heated the market's getting, we should sell everything. That wasn't appealing to the business because they were trying to grow their presence. I sold my shares in the business and then we sold all the assets. Everyone then looked back at the end of 2006 and said, well, gosh, you did really well, but you got out too early because the market was still booming. I got an approach, luckily at that time, from Close Brothers saying that they had a tricky situation. They had about £1 billion of assets under management in real estate, and would I come in and almost do a sort of consultancy role to sort that out? Multiple funds, lots of leverage, quite complex, tax-driven, sold through the IFA channels. And so I said, yes, as long as William can come with me, because he was my business partner. I didn't want to throw him under the bus at that stage. So we joined Close Brothers in the back end of 2006, early 2007, on a 3-year fixed price contract. And of course, by the middle of 2007, end of 2007, the markets were beginning to implode, and we weren't far away from Lehman's and the global financial crisis. So got incredibly lucky exiting at a time which, if you want to rewrite history, people now say, wow, you must have been you must have had great foresight to be able to do that. That's not true. It was simply the market circumstances meant that I didn't think I'd be competitive going forward. So at that point, again, another major decision to change.
And also a major career turn, a change again. So that's
back into an institution, having promised
distinct career paths already that we've kind of gone through, got embedded in, made a success of, but stopped, took stock, and decided to go into a different direction. So, okay, talk to me then about Close Brothers. I mean, we don't need to go through the whole sort of 3 years, but if we sort of fast forward to kind of the last year of that story.
Yeah, tough business. You're in the middle of the global financial crisis. You've got misbought and perhaps missold funds, difficult pieces of real estate, a very substantial team of people. So unfortunately, it involved having to let a lot of people go over a relatively short period of time. I thought I could tidy it all up in time, arrogantly thought that I had enough time to be able to do that and to perhaps relaunch Close Brothers' real estate business, a bit like the Morgan Grenfell business of yesteryear. But it was pretty obvious that their investor base and indeed their senior management fell out of love with real estate quite quickly when the problems began to surface. So sorted it out as good as possible, sold an awful lot of their funds and spent a lot of time working through difficult assets with banks during the latter stages of 2008, early 2009, which gave me a belief that there was an opportunity to launch a business specifically focused on helping the banks through their more difficult assets in what was probably the most illiquid marketplace I'd ever worked in. So the end of the 3 years happened. Amicably, we parted ways. William and I, in effect, formed Cooke and Powell again, which was the early APAM in 2009 to service the banks and their defaulting loan books.
So this was into Close Brothers as a consultant or employee, and realising that there's a niche here that's underserved in the market and that you think you're good at and that you've worked hard at. So you leave Close Brothers and you launched Cooke and Powell again.
Well, I was also incredibly lucky. Having left Close Brothers, I decided, and again comes back to my sporting background, I had a lovely friend who played alongside me at London Irish, a chap called Neil Murphy, who had sadly had a very serious brain hemorrhage and later subsequently died. And we started playing old man's vets rugby to raise money for Neil in 2008. And by 2009, I had asked Peter Winterbottom, the famous British Lion, a chap who I'd known all his rugby career, if he would like to lead a team to South Africa to play against the Pirates side that he'd played for in 1989 in Johannesburg for a last game, last tour, full contact, 50-year-olds bashing each other up during the British Lions tour in 2009. And of course, everyone was excited by this. We put a great team of people together, many from the property industry, many from my rugby connections, many from Cambridge days. It was only at the very end of that tour that I was sat nursing some broken ribs and a headache when a chap called Tony Edgley, who is well known in the industry, who was on that trip, put his arm around me and said, "What are you going to do when you get back?" And I said, "I think the only thing I can do when I get back is look at these banks and see whether we can help them through the process." And he introduced me to a company called Hatfield Phillips. I don't think that name exists anymore, but it became part of LNR, and they were one of the biggest servicers of CMBS loans in the market. And that was, again, my first break in relation to working out problem assets for banks or service providers.
And this was you and William?
Me and William on our own, 2009. William had gone off to Australia, met his future wife, and had come back. We were beginning to start to talk to others, but we couldn't attract anybody else into that environment. So yeah, it was just the two of us. And we got some lucky breaks. We got stuck into some interesting transactions. We got paid quite well. But by probably 2010, the low-hanging fruit, certainly in London, wasn't available. And there was a lot more granular, much harder development type stock in the regions. And that's when I was introduced to David Russell in Manchester. And we formed APAM literally on a 50-50, no money in. He put in his connections, his development team in Manchester, who would be incredibly valuable resource. And we just threw the thing together and decided to work on any basis that people would employ us to sort out the mess. And that became a very successful business after 3 or 4 years.
And just for people listening at home, could you talk us through, a typical example mess that you were getting in to help?
Yeah, these were banks taking back property where keys had been handed back by defaulting borrowers. They were either half-completed developments. They were properties that were bought on a portfolio basis where the banks didn't really understand what they owned. They were, we did some work for Dunbar Assets. Again, that business doesn't exist anymore, part of the Allied Dunbar Bank. They had been lending money to a developer who had pretty much a credit facility that he could just draw down on, and they didn't even know what they were lending against. Small residential development sites. We had a really interesting hostel in King's Cross where all sorts of dodgy behaviour was taking place. We had to start from the very basics. We had to go to the buildings. We had to understand what they owned. We had to understand what the leases allowed you to do. We had to understand what the development opportunity was. Roll your sleeves up and sort it out and report back into the banks and then be paid on a performance basis of raising the value of those because obviously they wanted to liquidate as quickly as possible.
This is the asset you've got. This is what we think you should do with it, and here's our plan for it.
Yeah.
That's you implementing that plan, whether that be refurbishment, knock down, rebuild, whatever the outcome was, and then allowing the bank to liquidate the asset, and that's where you got paid.
And very often the principle was you needed to be brutally honest with them, because if there wasn't a plan that you genuinely believed you could deliver, the best advice for both of us was just dump it. Stick it in the auction room, give it to an agent, just sell it for whatever you can get for it in the market. Because we knew that we didn't want to be saddled with difficult real estate that was going to get more difficult, and we weren't going to deliver a result for the bank, because we weren't going to get paid on the back of that. So by default, we became very rigorous about the way we approached the exit route for a piece of real estate and how much value we could add. And often the banks would say, well, Simon, that's not enough. We're just going to sell it. And we would say, that's fine. That's absolutely what you should be doing.
So we're talking, so that's sort of '09 to 15, growing the business. In up to kind of 2016, you're now dealing with much bigger institutions.
Well, we pivoted. Remember that what happened was the US private equity group suddenly turned up. We hadn't even heard of people like Oaktree, Lone Star, Cerberus, HIG, TPG. These guys hadn't really been in the UK real estate markets, but of course they had become the big buyers of the loan books. So they had started in America buying the big loan books, and then they come to the UK and really were beginning to roll out large-scale purchases of debt from the banks, who were desperate now to wholesale those defaulting positions out. And of course, they needed competence to help them in terms of working through those loans as well. So we got, again, lucky because we were seen to be an advisor of choice in relation to some of those opportunities. And we picked up fantastic mandates, as I said, from Cerberus, from Oaktree, from Patron Capital, and from a company called Varde, which is a large US Minnesota-based opportunistic fund as well. And that gave us an opportunity to, become bigger and employ more people and really ply our wares across a variety of real estate opportunities with very demanding international clients who really needed clarity of reporting, and with often debt providers as well in place where we were having to provide duties of care. So we had to build a different type of team, a very strong team of people, some of whom are still with us today. Sinead Kenny, one of our managing directors, had an American opportunistic fund background, and so it was a very easy for me to use her to, in effect, translate our parochial UK real estate approach to an American, in effect, hedge fund.
And up until that point, still a privately owned business?
Yep. David, myself and William owned the business. Now, as it was getting more complex, more institutional, and as the markets recovered, David wanted to get on with his development business in Manchester and re-employ, in effect, the development people who we'd been using in APAM. And to that extent, there was some potential clashes, conflicts of interest. But also, I knew as well the Americans, particularly, were now focusing on continental Europe, and we didn't have the expertise to follow them there, the history, the knowledge, and I wasn't really ambitious enough to be able to start buying in European teams of people. So we decided to refocus the UK business on a more institutional, longer-term, lower cost of capital basis. And that also didn't suit necessarily David's entrepreneurial development hat. In 2016, we decided to look for a buyer for the business. That would mean that David would be bought out in full, and William and I might take a little bit off the table and carry on with a new partner as such, financial partner, in a more Morgan Grenfell style or Close Brothers style business. Obviously, we were building up to marketing the business when the referendum was announced. I decided to pull any sale because I was pretty confident that the vote would be much narrower than the public were anticipating, or indeed the economists were anticipating. And I thought that particularly if we were selling to an international investor, they would perhaps say yes before the referendum, but then want to have a second look after the referendum. And so we decided it was too risky to expose the business to a market. And it wasn't until 2017, when things had settled down, that we managed to find Catella through a formal process. We had offers from others. Catella was a very good fit, European business, Stockholm-based, but with funds and expertise across the whole of Europe. Nothing in the UK. They had it in the past, had ownership of businesses in the UK, but nothing that looked like ours. They were a great fit, and they gave us the money to be able to buy David out and reinvent the business again.
So that's 2017.
Well, the deal closed in 2018, but you're right, yeah.
So just to kind of bring us up to date, because I want to touch on a few other things this afternoon if I can, particularly your extracurricular interests. But in terms of APAM then, from 2018 to present day, obviously the business is still growing, and there's different businesses that have emerged within the Catella APAM brand, namely Bankfoot and Vantage.
Well, the nature of real estate, as you know, has changed, and therefore businesses that are in real estate need to change. The low cost of money environment meant that there had been generally a lack of understanding of the increasing risks that were taking place in real estate. We'd had Brexit, then we had the pandemic, we had the change of the influence and impact of technology. You had the high street retail versus the online retail impacts. And the occupier was getting much more challenged in relation to the cost base as well of running their businesses. And of course, if the spreadsheet worked because of low interest rates, there were still people piling into the market, which kept the value of real estate up at a time when it should have been going down to reflect the risks that were building up. So we knew, because we were a workout team, we were a pure asset manager, we were coming up with solutions for difficult bits of real estate and trying to drive the values significantly rather than just programmatically invest in retail or logistics or office buildings. We were looking at it as to what do we need to do to those buildings in order to make them fit for purpose in a changing environment. That meant we needed to bring in more development expertise. Certainly, we were very early on in the stage of greening buildings. We were improving office buildings from 2014-15 onwards because occupiers were demanding it. When I first started in the business, we were arguing about raised floors and air conditioning. Now the most important things was amenity and bike racks and shower facilities and a well-being space. Completely different approach to the occupier. So that is impacting on the skill sets. So we needed to build businesses. Bankford, fantastic development management business, now fully integrated within the business, run by Chris Moore. More latterly, we've launched Vantage, which is fundamentally a decarbonisation principal contractor, because we are being able to fill we're being able to supply so much opportunity for those businesses, and it's the right thing for the clients that we're acting for to be doing to their buildings.
So that's getting into a building, analysing it, coming up with the strategy, but then having the in-house capabilities to deliver
it. Exactly, rather than going to a third-party expert in that. Fully integrated, multi-services, market agnostic. In other words, we don't say you should be doing this or you should be doing that, and sector agnostic business.
And who are the target clients for that? Is that again large institutions, or is it more?
It's a variety. We act for high net worth individuals, Danish pension funds, local authority pension funds. We act for government, so we've been doing a large piece of work for Places for London on all their stations in London recently. We act for local authorities themselves in terms of regeneration of town centre as well. And we act for any number of REITs. So, for example, Capital Land, one of the largest REITs in the world, bought the Arlington Business Park off Patron Capital, and we carried on with that project to finish off the job for them. So a very wide variety of capital partners, all of which have different risk-return aspirations and appetites, and all of which have different approaches to sector and region. So it's a really interesting business because it is a multifaceted, multi-service business. But fundamentally, the job we do, is we hope, is deliver the best advice and the best business plan at the asset level.
Talk to me about, because we are coming to the end now, a typical day in the life of you. I think, you've got a lot going on, and I think, APAM as a business alone, full-time job. Bankford, full-time job. Vantage, full-time job. But I know equally as important to you, part of the work side, is your extracurricular kind of activities. And there's three things that spring to mind from our previous conversations: Zambia, Antarctica, and the 2041 school project. Now, we're not going to have that much time to sort of go too much into them, but I'm curious to kind of, I suppose, understand your take on your priorities now as an individual. Clearly you have been business focused throughout your career. Do you notice that's changing in terms of what's more important to you? And then perhaps if we can touch on those three things and what they do, that would be great.
I've always been passionate about people, and I've always believed that business is more about people than about just making money or getting strategic calls right. I think it's about the impact. Everything you do has an impact on somebody else, good or bad, the recognition of that. And if you can make sure that everything you do has a positive impact, even if it is just making money then gives you the opportunity to have a positive impact, that should be at the center of the ethos of the teams that you're working with. So in order to do that, we have a very strong phrase, which is, it's not good enough just being good, you've got to be doing good. And we try and instill that on everybody. Everybody is employed at APAM because they're told that they're very good at their jobs, and they've been employed because they're technically brilliant, but more importantly, they've been employed because they're nice people. They care about people. They care about their teammates. They make sure they work as a team. There's no egos. And that's a really important component. Now that leads into, and so why wouldn't we want as a team to share that with the rest of the world and carry out initiatives? So, for example, we support a sports day in Zambia, as you mentioned, in the middle of nowhere. We go every year, missed out a couple of times during COVID, but we've been going since 2018 now, sponsoring a sports day for 600 kids in the middle of the bush in Africa, where we feed them. We try to play netball. We get knocked out in the first round every year. We have an amazing time. But we take people from our accounts team in Manchester who would never normally get the opportunity of being in a rural village in the middle of nowhere in Africa, and also have that opportunity to give back. The 2041 School Project is a completely different project. My wife has an educational business through rugby connections. My great mate Stephen Moriarty got remarried a couple of years ago, introduced me and my wife to Robert Swan. Robert Swan was the first man, and he'd been at Durham University with Steve, was the first man to walk unassisted to both the North and the South Poles. He's got a film called In the Footsteps of Scott in 1986. So when we were in the West End of London playing our rugby and enjoying our beers and our deals, he was slogging across the Antarctic over 970 miles on his own to the South Pole. Anyway, he's a massive believer in supporting the Antarctic, preserving the Antarctic. Jenny's a massive believer in education. And so we've launched the 2041 School Charity, and we have some of the most wonderful films and educational resources which we're now giving to schools around the world for free, because the production of them and all the time and hard work has been put in already, and they're now there. So yeah, anybody who is interested in the Antarctic, even if you're not a 5 to 12-year-old, please have a look at 2041school.com. They're fantastic films, and we've even got the wonderful Joanna Lumley as the voice of Antarctica.
I'll have to have a look, and we'll put the link in the show notes so anyone listening can have a look. Look, I think that kind of brings us to a natural conclusion of our conversation this afternoon, which on a personal level has been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope our listeners do as well. For anybody that is listening that wants to reach out to Simon, I say we'll put his contact details in the show notes, but you could Google APAM and they'll come up.
One of the things I would add, and thank you very much, Stephen, for giving me the opportunity, is that I am a great believer in having a coffee with anybody, because often that person will have an opportunity or an idea which you can help and capitalize on. But more importantly, luckily, having survived 42 years in a very tricky marketplace, and as you say, made quite a lot of changes in my career, I can objectively just look at people's challenges and often perhaps give a bit of advice, maybe a bit of help, maybe a phone number or so to help them on their way. And I think that's a really important part and a relevant part of having been lucky enough to survive 42 years in real estate.
Well said. Thank you, Simon. This podcast is sponsored by Fidgins, a London-based cost consultancy. Please visit fidgins.co.uk to find out more about our market-leading service and some of the amazing clients we get to work with. We're super open to guest recommendations for this podcast, so if there's anyone in the industry you'd like to get on the show, please visit the website or send me a message on LinkedIn and I'll try to make it happen. Thanks, and bye for now.